As we move into the fourth part of Module 5, we thought we'd look at the question, how will you know when to adjust your use of reinforcement? And this is often a critical conversation that you'll have with those collaborators in your classroom, with those that you work with across your grade. I've done a good job developing my program. Now how do I know I'm doing it most effectively? How do I know it's having the biggest bang for its buck? And that's what we hope to address in Part 4. So when you're looking at how to acknowledge and implement different reinforcement strategies, you may want to look at your schedule of reinforcement. Before we get to that, the important consideration is, what data have you collected? Have you collected data to monitor how well your token economy has worked? How often you've given out tokens? Have you established a behavior contract in your classroom and re-referenced and prompted students towards that behavior contract over time? Have students continue to have behavioral challenges, or have they continued to have behavior successes? What behavioral data do you have in place in your classroom, and how can you utilize that data to leverage improvement and sustain positive efforts in your room? Second way to know when to adjust for your use of reinforcement. Consider the time of year that you're implementing your system or your new system, the time of day you're implementing it, and specific needs of your students. These needs may fluctuate and change over time, and depending on where you are in your phase of implementation, you may very well indicate a different level of reinforcement. Also, remember and consider specific contingent praise from Part 2. Specific contingent praise is one of your most efficient go-to reinforcement-based strategies that you can consistently and should consistently apply in and around your classroom. So reflect on your own practice. Have you been implementing contingent praise when students have been performing appropriate behaviors? If not, perhaps you need to improve upon that. If you have, excellent. See if you can keep that up. This fourth bullet, consider various schedules of reinforcement. This goes a bit deeper to a level of actual monitoring of your programming and focusing on how often you deliver different types of reinforcement in your classroom. And this is what we'll be talking about on the next slides. When you're considering how and when to deliver reinforcement to your students, consider the next few slides and consider these different schedules of reinforcers. These are the basics. First, you have an approach known as non-contingent reinforcement, or NCR. Effectively, a non-contingent reinforcement approach is actually an antecedent-based strategy, whereby a teacher identifies fixed intervals or periods of time by which they're going to deliver reinforcement to student when they've exhibited appropriate behavior across that period of time. For example, if a student's challenging behavior functions to obtain teacher attention, using a non-contingent reinforcement approach would effectively give the student the attention they needed, thereby meeting the function of their challenging behavior before that behavior is manifested. So non-contingent reinforcement approach is a great way to reduce the likelihood of challenging behaviors across a fixed interval schedule by providing the student functionally the need that they have for when they exhibit that challenging behavior before that behavior occurs. On the other end of this graphic, you see the word contingent. Contingent schedules of reinforcement fall across a variety of approaches. First, you have continuous contingent reinforcement schedules. Here, you are effectively providing reinforcement consistently and continuously across your school day and activities. On the opposite end of that continuum, you have an approach known as extinction. When you're putting a behavior on extinction, you are systematically removing reinforcement to a student contingent on their inappropriate behavior. In other words, you're consciously making a decision that what was previously reinforced no longer will be. You're removing that reinforcement. That will put that behavior on extinction. In the middle, you have something called intermittent schedules of reinforcement, from which there are three. The first is a ratio schedule. In a ratio schedule of reinforcement, you're looking to reinforce behavior after a certain number of responses. For example, using a ratio intermittent schedule of reinforcement, you're going to praise every third attempt the student takes to shoot a basket. Every third shot, the student gets reinforcement. Shot 3, they get reinforcement. They take an attempt, shot 6, they get reinforcement. Every third attempt using a ratio approach, student receives that reinforcement. The final type of intermittent schedules are known as response duration reinforcement schedules. In this case, what you're looking to do is reinforce the student's response following a specified period of time. So in this case, the student must exhibit a behavior for a specific duration of time prior to receiving your reinforcement. As an example, you deliver praise if a student has been in their seat for 3 whole minutes. Different from interval-based reinforcement, where you are providing reinforcement contingent on a student's first appropriate behavior after a specified interval. In response duration, the student must manifest or exhibit an appropriate behavior for a certain period of time or duration. Each of these three types of intermittent-based reinforcement schedules are our key and our target when developing a reinforcement-based monitoring schedule. Now, each of these three types of intermittent reinforcement schedules can be split into fixed or variable systems. In a fixed system, you're providing reinforcement after exactly a certain number of responses in a ratio system. After the first response after a specific period of time using interval system, or using a fixed response duration after the student has performed exactly a certain number of minutes or seconds of a behavior do they receive reinforcement. On the contrary, a variable-based system in any of these three models means that you hover around a specific ratio, a specific interval, or a specific duration of behavior prior to providing that contingent reinforcement. So effectively, you have 6 different types of reinforcement-based schedules within the interval reinforcement system. This graphic depicts the 6 different schedules that we would target for you to monitor if you're going to be monitoring your reinforcement schedule in the class. In this first column, you'll see the 3 types of fixed schedules. In the subsequent column, you'll see the variable schedules. If it's a ratio fixed interval schedule, what you're looking to do is reinforce after every nth response. If you're using a ratio variable-based schedule, you're reinforcing after an average of n responses. Interval, same idea. Using a fixed interval schedule, you're going to reinforce the first response after n minutes. Whereas if you're using a variable interval schedule, you'll reinforce the first response after an interval of an average of n minutes, the key word there being the average. And finally, response duration. In a fixed response duration schedule, you're going to reinforce after a behavior has continued for a set number of minutes or seconds as you've defined it. In a variable duration schedule, you will be reinforcing after the behavior has continued for an average number of minutes or seconds as you specified. The big idea when we're talking about schedules of reinforcement is that in general, using a variable schedule produces smoother behavioral patterns for your student and should be highly considered when developing and monitoring your behavioral protocols in your classroom. Let's take a look now at what these different reinforcement schedules might look like using the same teacher prompt in question. If applying a continuous reinforcement approach, we're going to want to make sure that we're providing reinforcement after every prompt and/or question. So, if the teacher prompt in question is who is ready for recess, if you have a target student or group of students, you would effectively provide them reinforcement every time they responded appropriately to that prompt. So in this case, every time they've lined up for recess. Next prompt, please put away your materials. Again, every time that your target student or group of students apply putting away their materials contingent on your prompt, they would get reinforcement. Or lining up by the door when I call on your row. As soon as that row is called on, if they line up at the door appropriately, you will provide them whatever the reinforcement is in your system. Using an intermittent fixed ratio, again using the same teacher prompts, we're going to look to reinforce after every second prompt or question. Again, the second is arbitrary and it would be set by you as the teacher. So for this example, if your prompt is who is ready for recess and your target student shows this desired behavior, you would be providing reinforcement after every second prompt or question. So in every second trial or opportunity the student has to get ready for recess, they would receive reinforcement. Similarly, every second opportunity students have to put their materials away, they would receive reinforcement. And every second opportunity in this situation that students have to line up by the door when their row is called, they would receive reinforcement. Using an intermittent fixed ratio approach, you have established what that ratio will be, and you've now consistently applied it in implementation. Through an intermittent variable ratio reinforcement approach, you're going to look to reinforce after a variable number of completed assignments has occurred. So here, the teacher action may be that they're varying the number of complete assignments needed to earn reinforcement. So the student completes their assignment, they don't get reinforcement one time. They perhaps get reinforcement only after the second assignment has been completed. They may then need to complete 4 more assignments before reinforcement is earned. Perhaps then only 1 more assignment is needed to be completed before they get reinforcement. Effectively what you're doing is varying when you're delivering reinforcement contingent on students' delivery of expected behavior. Teachers providing reinforcement after one of the completed assignments, perhaps then 3, perhaps then 5, perhaps then back down to 2. That again, that variation is dictated and decided upon by you as the teacher. Here's an example for an intermittent fixed duration reinforcement schedule approach. Here, you're going to reinforce after a certain period of time has elapsed. For example, let's say that we're going to reinforce after every 30 seconds of on-task behavior. Here, your action as a teacher would be perhaps using a timer or some device that allows you to efficiently and practically measure time in your classroom while delivering instruction. So here, using a timer to determine when delivery of reinforcement is needed. In this circumstance, when 30 seconds is our established duration, once the student has showed desired behavior for 30 seconds, the teacher would then provide reinforcement to that student. The timer would then start anew, and every 30 seconds, the student would be receiving that reinforcement. Intermittent variable duration reinforcement schedules. Here, we're focusing on an unpredictable amount of time before reinforcement is delivered. For example, let's say that reinforcement is delivered after a variable amount of time of silent reading. So the teacher action, when implementing, that the teacher can use a timer and set different times or can choose randomly different interval lengths to deliver that reinforcement. So, as a target is showing or demonstrating the desired behavior, in this case, silent reading, the teacher is going to intermittently provide reinforcement across different lengths or durations of time. So here the teacher provides reinforcement for 10 seconds, then again after 1 minute. Perhaps the third duration is 3 minutes. Perhaps the next duration is back down to 2 minutes. Again, those durations will be dictated by you as the implementer, and reinforcement is implemented variably across time. For more information on any of these approaches to reinforcement schedules, please click on the link at the bottom of your screen. Moving forward, some considerations to follow when looking at the acknowledgement plan you choose to select and implement in your classroom. First, if you are just beginning your initial implementation of your behavior protocol, whether that's a token economy, a behavior contract, the increased use of specific contingent praise, or some level of group contingency, if it's something new in your classroom, you should focus on a more dense reinforcement schedule where you're naming the behavior, you're initially teaching the behavior to the students, and you're tying that behavior back to your class-wide expectations. So, if your acknowledgement plan is focusing on new behaviors, new learning for your students, you should have a reinforcement plan that is more immediate, is high frequency, and more predictable for your students. A second consideration. If you have taught your students now your appropriate expected behaviors, you've reinforced and sustained those behaviors over time, and now you're focusing on maintaining and generalizing those behaviors in and around your school day and across your school year, you may want to fade some of your actual reinforcement and go to a more intermittent or unexpected schedule to bring some surprise to students as they earn this reinforcement and recognition. The idea here is over time students do not rely on as much reinforcement as they initially had. Therefore, you should consciously make a decision on how and when you can fade out your identified reinforcers and maintain the success and the integrity of the program you have developed. And a final consideration, you should also look at your long-term celebrations. So in the token economy conversation, we did discuss backup reinforcers, and those reinforcers students may work towards over time. For your entire class, it would be beneficial for you to think about over time, perhaps bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, maybe twice a year, some larger celebration or reward the entire class can partake in to recognize their appropriate and positive efforts across your school year. On this slide, we want to continue the conversation and look at how we can consider different types of acknowledgement structures in your classroom and around your school. You should reflect on ways to design structures and have mechanisms in place for regular recognition of positive behaviors from both your students and other adults that may be in your classroom, to recognize positive events as well as positive activities that have occurred in and around your school building. So first, as we've discussed and has been the primary focus of this module, you can identify ways that staff recognize students. Ways to identify, communicate, and publicly recognize excellence in your school-wide, as well as in your classroom, are critically important. And we've talked about those at length. You should also consider ways that staff recognize other staff. Create and promote opportunities for staff and administration to recognize and appreciate other staff. This begins to get into the realm of school-wide positive behavior supports. At a school-wide level, do we have mechanisms and structures in place to identify staff that are doing very positive things with our students, with our programming, and with our contingent supports. A third category for reflection is how students may recognize staff. Most commonly, there are student-to-staff recognition systems and protocols in place at middle schools and high schools. However, that's not exclusively at middle schools and high schools. Regardless of the level of student that you work with, you may look to identify and create ways for students to share and appreciate staff that they work with. And then finally, school to student. At the school-wide level or the grade-wide level, you have mechanisms in place to identify positive attendance rates, positive student grades, student behavior. Perhaps you look at state assessment scores, improvement efforts going on in your school, or other elements that you might be able to recognize individual students, groups of students, entire grades, or at times entire schools. So, school to student mechanisms in order to help you identify and acknowledge appropriate progress for your students is all important. Overall, each of these buckets of considerations for how you'll acknowledge your students as well as staff should be considered when developing, again, a holistic and comprehensive behavior program. This will be the last activity in your workbook for this module. This activity, Activity 4.8, is a stop and jot, focusing on your timing of reinforcement. So in your workbook, jot some notes regarding each of the following. First, for which behaviors will you use frequent or high rates of reinforcement? For which behaviors will you use intermittent reinforcement to promote maintenance? When and how might you fade reinforcement of mastered skills? And finally, how do you think you can encourage other forms of reinforcement? For example, student-to-student reinforcement, student-to-staff reinforcement. Consider this and others during your reflection on this stop and jot. When considering how and when to deliver reinforcement to your students, be sure to remember that immediate, high-frequency delivery that are very predictable to your students should be the approach you use when you're teaching students new behaviors. This approach is important when delivered at a high rate for a short period of time while teaching students new skills. Intermittent and unexpected approaches, more variable approaches to your reinforcement schedules, are typically used and implemented when you're looking to maintain a previously taught behavior. Through these approaches, you're looking to bring surprise and attention to certain behaviors at scheduled intervals. And finally, consider long-term celebrations. You're going to want to always celebrate and acknowledge student and class-wide accomplishments across your school year, and focus on including all students and all adults in your room during these celebrations.